The Power of Politeness. Mastering weak obligations in English. Hello everyone and welcome to our latest video. Today, we'll be delving into the fascinating world of modal verbs, focusing particularly on weak obligations. Understanding how to express these correctly will greatly enhance your conversational English skills and help you communicate more effectively and subtly. Let's get started. Weak obligations are actions or behaviors that are not strictly necessary, but are generally good or helpful to do. They're a less intense version of strong obligations and typically indicate polite suggestions or advice rather than firm requirements. In English, we often use the modal verbs should and ought to express weak obligations. For example, you should brush your teeth after every meal. You ought to call your mother more often. Both of these sentences express advice or recommendations, not strict requirements. Should is probably the most commonly used verb to express weak obligations. For example, you should try this new restaurant downtown. The food is amazing. Remember, should is usually used to give advice or make recommendations, and it implies that the action is not obligatory, but is a good idea. Ought to is slightly less common than should, but it's still useful to know. It is a little more formal, and typically used in more formal or polite contexts. For example, you ought to write a thank you note to your host. It's good manners. Again, it's important to remember that ought to doesn't express a strong obligation. It's merely a suggestion or piece of advice. Now it's time to put what we've learned into practice. Here are some exercises you can do to practice using should and ought to. 1. Complete the sentences with should or ought to. 2. You blank. Remember to take your umbrella. It might rain later. 3. They blank. Apologize for their mistake. 4. Convert the following strong obligation sentences into weak obligations using should or ought to. 5. You must study for the exam. 6. He must clean his room. Feel free to pause the video and take your time. Once you're done, you can play the video again to check your answers. Here are the answers to the exercises. 1. You should remember to take your umbrella. It might rain later. 2. They ought to apologize for their mistake. 3. You should study for the exam. 4. He ought to clean his room. How did you do? Remember, the more you practice, the more natural these expressions will become. And that's it for this video on expressing weak obligations in English. We hope that you found this video useful and that you now feel more confident using should and ought to when giving advice or making suggestions. As always, keep practicing, and before you know it, these phrases will be second nature to you. Happy studying, and we'll see you in our next video.